Hi, I'm Bresden O'Malley with my co-manager host, Rusty Tanton. Welcome back to The One-on-One. And if you're new here, welcome. The One-on-One is the podcast built for the people who keep the software industry moving. Our mission is simple: to create a platform where engineers, leaders, and tech professionals can have real, honest conversations about the work we do, the challenges we face, and the industry shifts shaping our future.
Our guest today is Alex Bruce, a go-to-market and revenue growth leader and advisor. Alex, as Chief Revenue Officer at Spark, helped exponentially grow the company from $20 million in 2016 to $135 million in 2023. In June 2023, Spark was acquired, and after helping with the transition, hiring his replacement, and successfully handing over the torch after a 6-month onboarding, Alex transitioned out of this role 1 year later in July 2024. His role with Spark today is executive advisor and investor. Today, Alex is involved with several organizations all aimed at go-to-market advising and consulting.
We are going to be tackling some kind of fun topics, including demystifying the sales process for engineers and why and how engineers should seek out ways to get involved and support sales pursuits that their company may engage with. Let's get into it. Alex, thank you so much for being here. This is your one-on-one. What would you like to talk about?
Sure. So I've always thought the topic of kind of demystifying, or actually someone gave me a new word, decoding the mind of the salesperson or the sales process. And in working in both tech and also consulting services over the last 25 plus years, I've had the pleasure of leading the go-to-market team, sales engineering, customer success, marketing, etc. But working very closely along the way to involving folks from, whether it's from the dev organizations or the broader CIO and or CTO organizations. So it could be Scrum Masters, could be architects, could be devs, could be cloud engineers, could be data, whatever it might be. And I've always been really interested in seeing how that works really well and observing those who want to do that versus maybe, it's like pulling teeth, or those who are naturally good at it versus not, and also those who got good at it over time. And ultimately, the reason that I've always tried to involve, I'll say, that side of the house and those type of individuals is because if you have really good people and you know how to plug them in and set them up for success, it gives you, I think, a distinct advantage when you're in front of buyers or prospects, as we say, or clients or customers, whatever the term might be. And so, I don't know, I've always kind of thought about how do we help people understand better, get dialed in, and not just be good at it, effective at it, but want to do it and maybe understand, hey, why this might be good for me if I'm a dev or I'm an SDET or I'm a Scrum Master or I'm a, whatever it might be. So anyway, I love the topic and really happy to be on here. So Rusty and Bresden, both, thanks for inviting me and having me. And, let's see what we think.
That's awesome. I have to say, I went from a software developer role into a role where I was working very closely with you, Alex, and I was a part of.
I remember it fondly.
It was actually pretty mind-blowing, which is why I'm excited about this conversation, because I did not understand the sales process when I got into that role, and I just didn't know what was happening on that side of the house. Many engineers see sales as a different world.
Yeah.
Honestly, what are some of those biggest misconceptions engineers have about salespeople and their sales process? And like, how do we really understand what's going on? Because we're just told to build something and we build it, but we have no idea what happened before that.
No, it makes perfect sense. And it's really the same from the other side, right? I mean, sometimes
That's
whether
fair.
it's sales or finance or accounting, non-technical, I'll say, disciplines, right? Or groups
Mhm.
or whatever it might be. It's like, what do they do? The old adage of, hey, just throw some burgers over the wall and they'll love it and they'll throw something, right? I mean, just as not offensive per se, but off that might be, right? It's, well, when you think of sellers, And I've done this at least a dozen times over 20 years when I'm typically getting in front of non-sales audience. And it could be within their own company, sometimes at a big, like large company meetings, or when I'm coming in for the first time, oftentimes where sales are stuck, right? And they bring somebody in, and hopefully can unstick them, right? And what I'll do is I'll say, okay, let me understand when I say the word salesperson, what words come to mind? And I'm usually in front of
Hmm.
a group, and I usually have a whiteboard or an easel, and I have a some type of writing instrument. And the words that come back are not positive,
There's usually some
I'm already
colorful
laughing.
language in there.
right?
Yeah.
It's things like cheesy, greedy, sleazy, fast talking, lazy. It's all these negatives that on some level I understand, because the vast majority of people don't buy B2B service and products. They have worked with salespeople, oftentimes with what? What's the first thing that comes to mind? A car,
The car.
Yeah.
right? Cars easier. It used to be worse, right? Buying cars is not as, although sometimes it still can be. Um, or maybe telesales, people calling in the home, or insurance. But there are things that, let's face it, it's oftentimes less than a pleasant experience. And that is
Mm.
spearheaded because of the salesperson that people are dealing with.
Huh.
And so what I'll often do is say, okay, let's kind of think about what we want to have here at our organization or at your organization, right? Or ideally. And all my experience has been B2B, and it's usually larger ticket items. So large enterprise software, consulting services. A lot of times we could be building a product for a large organization, or even a SaaS company, helping them roll products out. But either large enterprise software or building software, or other related aspects, whether it be security, compliance, whatever it might be. But it's B2B, and it's not a small ticket item. And when the people who are successful, and when I'm building teams, what I try to paint the vision of, you should expect your salespeople, well, regardless of the titles, doesn't matter, to first and foremost be really curious. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I think teachers and business analysts and salespeople have in common, really good ones, they are very curious.
Yeah.
Mm.
And it's hard to do discovery, because teachers are often the best learners, and you got to discover, right? Business analysts, what do they got to do? They got to discover, if you think about it, right? Whether it's agile BAs or technical BAs or functional BAs, doesn't matter. And the top sellers are very curious, because they should discover, and it should be sincere. It shouldn't be, I have 8 questions I'm going to ask. So let me read off my paper here. And, that's not curious, right? That's reading from a script. So things like curious, things like really, really focused on sincerely trying to solve problems. So you're
Mm.
curious, so you can discover, perhaps, hey, there's a problem here, and I know what my company's products and their services do, and I think there's an alignment here, right? So curious to be able to see if we can solve a problem. And if you focus on those type of things, and then also really good, I'll say shepherds, or I learned a new term recently, Sherpas. So we're looking at doing a trip, and apparently we might need a Sherpa, right? So a Sherpa to help guide, right? As opposed to being pushy. Hey, let me guide you, let me lead you, and let's do that together. And that's both with the client, but I'll say, to tie it back to the one-on-one podcast kind of concept around what we're talking about, is also internally, how do I lead a team, right? Because most large ticket enterprise B2B sales involves team-based selling. And you've got to be able to be a Sherpa for that team. So, anyway, I'll stop there. But, that's what I think oftentimes we think about sellers, and when people think about sellers. And I like to kind of say, let's demystify or decode that, because that is not the profile of the average, not below average, but the average, and I'll say really the top sales. That is not the profile.
Yeah.
It's close to the profile that I described.
I have one follow up, and I want to back up just a little bit to the sort of conceptions about sales from developers idea, and it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I've actually brought it up on several episodes of this podcast. Um, when when and Bresden alluded to it, when dev gets something and it's a surprise from sales, they're sort of shaking their fists like, oh, those a-hole sales guys, like why did they just dump this in our lap? Have you encountered, I know it's not necessarily at Spark, it could be at any point in your career. Have you encountered a situation where it kind of started off like that and it was going off the rails, but you were able to course correct and get dev and sales more aligned together?
Sure. No, absolutely. It's funny because that is a large issue that occurs
Yeah.
across the country and across the world, I'm sure, right? And not just in technical sales, but sales, but in manufacturing sales, pharmaceutical sales, probably all sales, right?
Yeah.
Some of it is bad, and some of it's really misconception, right? But it's funny because I was in Austin, Texas last Thursday, and I was speaking at a sales conference, and one of the implementers of this company stood up and not in a negative way, just said, "Well, I'm the guy who's got to solve the problems when the salespeople oversell, what we actually do, right?" It was a chuckle, right? And then he said, "Well, I don't really mean that, right? Let me tell you what I love, you know." But it's a common, and it's I'll guess perspective. So in some cases, and I think that's really the small percentage. Yes, somebody oversells, and I think it's a very small percentage where they do it intentionally and they misrepresent, and that shouldn't happen. And you should have checks in places where that doesn't happen, right? And they're not that hard to do. So now let's kind of take that next piece where maybe you oversell a little bit and you might sell to the roadmap, right? So I've always told folks we have to believe in our organization's roadmap. And when you stop
Yeah.
believing in the roadmap, then maybe it's just time for you, to do something else, right? Because let's face it, none of us look and go, this is what we do. Because what we do is always growing and evolving, right? And so when you're selling a product or even a service, right, and you sell to the roadmap, first of all, most times what you're selling that's available today, you don't sell today. What's available today and you sell today is really, what's going to be available, what's in the next release, right? So a lot of times it's selling to the roadmap, and then sometimes things move quicker, sometimes move slower. So sometimes there's that. What it also is really I'll say a misperception. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's unintentional by the buyer. And for any buyers who see this, I'm not at all saying that you, but sometimes we hear what we want to hear, right? And a lot of times, well, you sold this. Well, no, we didn't. In fact, look, it's very clear in our contract. This is what we said. Well, no, I remember somebody saying this. So sometimes it's also we hear what we want to hear.
Yeah.
And then sometimes it's just really, well, we said that the product or feature does this. Well, it doesn't do that. Well, yes, it does. It does that when we do this, right? So sometimes there's misconceptions, right? But it should be very, very small. And I mean small, a couple percentage points at best, where somebody's able to effectively oversell intentionally. And that's
Yeah.
not good for anybody. I think the next slice again is you sell on the roadmap, and I think the majority of it is really, well, yeah, it can do that. We just got to be able to implement it this way, or turn this on, or maybe do a little custom design for this, right? So I think that's where that usually comes into play. And lastly, I'll say there's a lot of jokes about two professions, and it's really typically not the devs and the tech. It's lawyers and sales. So I think to some degree we're easy targets, right? So I think there's some of that too.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I really love the idea of essentially changing our mindset on what a salesperson is and what they look like. But what the one thing that I noticed when working with sales was just as an engineer being involved
Yeah.
with that sale and having my salesperson's back and them having mine
Hmm.
really changed the outcome of that client interaction. I'm curious, why do you think engineers should kind of raise their hand and seek out ways to get involved and support the sales pursuits?
No, I love the question. And again, part of why I love it is because I've seen a lot of success when organizations can tap into the technical folks. And I'll go beyond engineers, right? Because oftentimes it could be engineers, it could be esthets, it could be
Mm,
product, um,
right.
product strategists, product owners, it could be BAs, it could be, um, infrastructure folks and others, right? But I think, from a selfish perspective, if I'm, from the engineering side, from dev, first of all, I think it's, when something's good for your company, um, and it's good when you win new business, right? And so if you can be involved in some form or fashion of, I'll say the sales cycle, but let's kind of throw that term out. Let's think about a buyer evaluation process, right?
Mm,
Because we go and we talk to people, and and there's different aspects of a sales cycle or a buyer evaluation process. And when a company wins a new contract, it's a beautiful thing at all stages. It's more important at the smaller stage, right? Because if you got 10 customers, you win one, you just increase your customer base like 10%, right? If you're a $20 million company and you win a $5 million contract, you've increased your company by 25 million. We had a period, and President, you'll probably recall this period where over 3 months we booked three major contracts at
yeah.
Spark, then RSI, and that increased our run rate by almost 50% over a 6 month period by the time we got things started. It was pivotal. And so the people involved in that process, I built relationships with the people in terms of, throughout the country who were going to either help deliver upon those sold contracts or were helpful in terms of us convincing with sincerity the buyer in terms of we would be the best choice. And the people who were part of that, I think at the end of the day, they loved it and they wanted to do more, right? Because all of a sudden we started growing really quickly. And so, first of all, it's good for the company. Secondly, those who are associated with big victories, that could be a new product release or a new deal. Let's face it, executives take notice. Well, who was part of that,
Mm,
right? So it can be good for your career in a lot of ways, including just recognition that Rusty was part of that, or Alex was part of that, or Breslin was part of that. And all of a sudden, when
mhm,
Breslin's part of those last three, it's, maybe we should look at asking Breslin to do more. So I think it's also
mm.
just when you're a part of something successful, it's good for your career. So I think
Yeah.
those are top line answers that I'd share.
Yeah, I agree. And I will say I've worked both at companies where sales and development had very close relationships and talked to each other and actually worked together towards goals. And I've worked in organizations where, sales was way off over here doing its thing and development's way off over here doing its thing. And, in my experience, both of them kind of think they run the world in that situation.
Yeah.
So I much prefer the model you're describing where dev and sales talk to each other.
Yeah, it
Well,
is kind of interesting because, Alex, I'm still friends with you. I'm still friends with all of these salespeople that I've worked with. I work at a much smaller company, and I don't think I know a single name.
interesting.
So it is very different.
Well, it's interesting because there's aspects when you say get to know the other side of the business, right? And that includes getting to know people. So maybe I'll add another point, right? Is it it allows folks to get become aware of the other side of the house, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And when you become more involved with another side of the business, you become more involved with other people, right? And the fastest way to take the misconception around engineers from a sales perspective or from an engineering sales perspective, you get to know each other like, well, that engineer can eat and talk at the same time. Look at that. Huh? That salesperson actually seems to be telling the truth and knows what he or she is talking about, right? So I think it also allows, I'll say, the technical side of the house to get to know the other side of the business. And I'll also say more commercially minded, right? And, the best way to see how the product or service, as well as the company, is pitched in the marketplace is to see it firsthand. And sometimes the way the website or the way the CEO talks about it, not that it's diabolically or diametrically opposed, but certainly not diabolically opposed either, but sometimes the way that we have conversations with actual buyers, where you got to move past marketing slides and slogans. And when you see several ways that, oh, now I see that when we say our value prop is this, when we say our product is different because of this, or the way that we differentiate service, I understand now. And hopefully, and certainly was the way that we did it at Spark. I feel very confident in that and love that, is the way that we're positioning it in the field, right? At the buyer, at the individual conversation layer, when a developer or Scrum Master or an Agile BA, whatever, sees it, go, huh, yeah, I see that in the way we execute, right? And then I think it opens eyes, like, wow, I love this, right? And so I think seeing another side of the business for a lot of reasons, but also because you get to see other people in the other side of the business. And I think part of that, then, it helps you become more commercially minded. And as you continue your career, whether you go in a technical management role or you go up the technical track in terms of developer and then app engineer, and you might see it differently, right? I always thought there's application engineer, then there's solution engineer, and then there's architect, application architect, solution architect, enterprise architect.
Titles are all over the place. Yeah.
Right. But when you become more commercially minded, that usually helps your perspective. And oftentimes when you have a little additional layer to your conversations, it does cause or create perhaps opportunities to move up and to get some career advancements. I believe. I've seen that times.
I agree with all that. And one thing I'll also note is, in this climate where jobs are very hard to come by for developers, it is definitely one way you can make yourself stand out, is to actually build a relationship with the sales folks and to actually care about the business goals. Like, all the best developers I've ever worked with understood the business end of it too. They weren't just sitting there slinging code. I mean, I've worked with people who are content to just sling code, and they typically don't last as long.
And listen, if that's what they want to do, that's okay too. It's just,
sure,
you're going to have more, you're going to be more limited, right? You're going to have a clear path. But you mentioned when it's hard to get jobs, right? When you can, in the interview, with integrity, say, well, one of the things my company asked me to do more and more was to be part of, and whatever it has to do with in terms of being more commercially minded and being part of customer conversations, I can't imagine any scenario where that is not perceived as a strong positive from someone who is doing the interviewing, right? So I think you raise a good point.
Do you have any examples of a technical person who is really good and it impacted their career?
I do. And in fact, he's a former guest on the One-on-One podcast, Jackson Stakeman.
Jackson.
We love Jackson.
Now, Jackson, I don't know if he's going to see this, but Jackson, if you do, I'm gonna pump you up for a moment, right? But Jackson Stakeman was or is, he's an architect, right? And he was really good at his primary function of architecting solutions, and being a developer and everything else. And he's also very likable and very creative, right? He saw the bigger picture, right? He was the guy that when if you walk by him in the street and he was had a jackhammer and he was crushing cement, right? Yes, I'm not going to say I'm questions. He goes, I'm building a church, right? He'd be that guy, right? Because let me tell you about it. It's going to be amazing, right? And so Jackson Stakeman was a guy who, when he did raise his hand to be part of some client conversations and some loose solutioning conversations. And he did the type of things that, if you would ask me what are good qualifications or what are good habits or traits, whatever, and we could talk about that if you'd like at any point. But and he was really good at it. He was believable. He was impressive. He was likable. He would do the appropriate amount of research, which is not a ton, but on the company we were talking to, the individuals. I think most importantly, he would say, what is my role? How do you want to introduce myself? How do you want me to introduce myself?
Yeah.
What is my role? So not because he'd make anything up, right? What do you want me to emphasize? What's my role? When do you want me to interject? What do you want me to zero in on? And what do you want me to avoid?
Yeah.
Right. And I'm sure there were others if I thought through it, but the kind of the basics, right? And when he introduced himself, it was humble, but it was also bold. Because hey, your job is to get somebody's attention. Don't be mumbles, and don't just say, "All right, I've developed for 3 years." No, share what you're doing with the company. Share an example or three that's relevant. So if it's based on industry, or it's based on the cloud provider, or it's based on this relevant based on the situation, whatever it is, right? And when you answer a question, be crisp and clear, and know that you don't need to be the smartest guy in the room always. Sometimes answer the question and then pause, and don't go into too much detail. Allow someone to go, hey, I'd like to understand a little bit here. So, again, not to script it, because that would not be good for anybody, right? But just be mindful of answer the question and pause. And usually people will follow through with a question or two or three on areas that you can then go deeper. And so those who I think knew how to mix humility with bragging about themselves a little bit, those who really are curious is, I want to help. Tell me how to help. Tell me this, tell me this, tell me this. And if it's done right, they shouldn't have to ask that, right? Because what I've always guided sellers to do, when I've been involved, is I want to tee everybody up for success. And you kind of said, these are your roles. This is how I want everybody to introduce themselves. This is where I want you to interject. This is what I want you to stay away from and you to zero in on, right? But if for whatever reason you get involved with something and that's not put forward, ask those couple of questions so that you know what's expected and you know how to best help. Because lastly, I'll say, I think most people want to help, but oftentimes they don't know how. So just like anything else, give me a target, give me some basic guidelines. I got it. I want to help. Let me go. Right. And then lastly, if you mess up, you mess up. Most times people don't know. Right. So it's okay. It's okay. You don't have to be perfect. Right. Because unlike a code that's going to go in the product, right, this is not baked forever. Right. So if you answer something wrong, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Perfection is the enemy of great. Right. And so don't worry about being perfect all the
time. Yeah. I think you bring up a good point too, because, thinking back to the culture of an organization where, some organizations have a culture where devs and sales are in the same room, and then some places have the opposite. It's a lot easier to have a blameless retrospective when everybody was in the room the entire time and everybody saw everything. Because if everybody is not in the room the entire time, then that gives a lot of space for people's imaginations to run away with them, and to maybe, people sort of hear what they want to hear, see what they want to see.
No, I think you're right. And as you're saying it, so those who have worked for me, they know what I'm going to say next, right? A more cynical way to say what you just said is, when you get all the liars in the same room, there's a lot less lying. And, I hate to say it that way, but my experience is that is the case, right? And that is also the case when you have issues, right? Or when the he said, she said, right? Let's give it, and you got to also have the culture where we're not trying to find blame. We're trying to solve the problem. We're trying to make sure we don't repeat this, we fix it, or we don't repeat this issue. So there's no reason. But people tend to blame others less when they're in the room.
Mm,
I think it's okay to also be forthright, and speak the truth, even if someone's in the room, right? And we all got to be big boys and big girls, but it's much easier to do. But you have to have the culture where it's okay to be real, and it's okay to fail, right? It's okay to mess up, right? Because then, if it's not, then no, you shouldn't do that, right? Because then then there's whole different issues, right? But I think it's a great point you bring up, Rusty.
Thanks.
yeah, I do. I will say that without sales involved, but in the dev world, sometimes I have to work with third party applications, and that
Mm,
can be an incredibly difficult thing. And in your cynical statement of all the liars in the same room, you really see it happen when you finally can convince that third party to get in a room with you who has been throwing things kind of over the fence on,
Yeah.
"Oh, well, we didn't get a response from your API," and then all of a sudden, "Oh, are you getting a response now that we're on a call together? That's so funny." So I've seen that a lot, and it had nothing to do with sales. Like, we've
no,
already made that I love that view, and it kind of every time I'm asked to get on a call like that, I usually balk because I don't wanna be involved because it's an exhausting situation. But just hearing what you just said, and it kind of put all these pieces together, I think that it is so beneficial to be in the room and just deal with that in that 1 hour long meeting, because in the end, everything's gonna go smoother after.
Yeah.
and that's the key, right? It
Right.
feels like a waste of time, but if you can move past it, and that expression, unfortunately, isn't just sales or engineering or third party. It's life that can apply across business. It can apply across friends. Unfortunately, it can also apply to families, right? So
Mm.
listen, I got 3 kids. They're all grown now, but when they were little, yeah, I had to get them all, and I asked everybody, and I had to choose who I believed, right? Because even sometimes when they're all in the same room, they're still going, "I didn't do it. He did it. She did it." And sometimes I go, "You know what? I'm going with you. You did it. Go to timeout. Whether I was right or wrong, that's up to debate."
Yeah. Who left toothpaste in the sink? Not me. Not me. Not me. Yeah. I get all the not me's.
I really like it. I think bringing up kind of how to be successful is a really important topic as well. And just that, what is the best way to engage and support and increase the chances of winning for that new client or the customer, or even just moving a problem forward? Do you have any advice kind of around that process?
Sure. So we touched on a few of these already, right? But I guess I would say, if you think about, you tie it to, well, why should I want to do this, right? Ultimately, if it's good for your organization, as long as you're part of that organization, it should be good for you, right? It should be good for employees in general, right? So, um, and if you're going to do something, my view is do it and do it well. And that doesn't mean, by the way, you can also do it very efficiently, and there are ways to get muscle memory, right? And to get better at things faster, right? Certainly, there's nothing wrong with that, right? But if you're going to do something, then do it well, right? So, like anything else, right? Kind of make a decision. I'm going to give this my best in order to achieve the outcome. So, what I would say is, make sure that you understand what the outcome is. Now, the grand scheme of things, the outcome of a company is to make, if it's a for profit company, the outcome of a company that they're searching for is to make a profit, right? That's what the grand outcome is, right? So it's to win a contract. So kind of put the grand outcome out, right? I think of I think of sales similar to building a product. You do it one sprint at a time, right? If you're sprint based, right?
Right.
And you got to know the epic, and you got to know the release, and you got to know where you're going. So but you also have to focus on one sprint at a time. And so if you think about that, when you're getting involved with a conversation, it is a step in a sales cycle. And so I would always think about, make sure you understand what the outcome of the part of the conversation that you're getting involved in, because that's what it really is. It's the next conversation. Now, it could be taking a look at something and building reference architecture and then explaining that reference architecture, but that's for a step in the evaluation process, in the sales cycle. So understand, what are we going for? What's the outcome we're aiming for as a team? And start with that. Okay, now how do I plug into that, right? So and if it's not clear, right, or if people aren't making clear, ask the questions that we already talked about, like, what's my role? How do you want me to focus? What do you want me to avoid, etc. Right? But understand the outcome overall, and then the outcome of the step that you are involved with. Do your own research. So I would always encourage everybody, if you are showing up for, let's say, an internal meeting, right? A lot of times we call them preps. Let's prepare for the client call. And then maybe one prep, it may be two or three, maybe two, where some work's done in between by a number of folks, including, somebody from the development organization or the technical organization. I would always say, don't show up and say, well, what's the company? Who is it? Show up going, hey, it's the company so-and-so. And, you don't got to go, well, I research, you don't got to research forever, right? But show up understanding, hey, if I got this right, this is the same company in this industry. It looks like they've been growing. It's just might get, okay, great. So and ask a question or two. So you get grounded, and you also then demonstrate to the team, this person has come prepared. Because listen, I've been involved with not millions, but probably over 1,000 sales pursuits across my career. I'm old. Yeah, I'm old. I turned 60 in January. I'm old. I've been doing this long. And, I can tell when someone shows up and doesn't show up, and when they're going to show up, but not really. And it affects the way that then I kind of interact and kind of ask of people, right? Because if I have a 6-person team, and it seems to me that one person didn't really show prepared, I'm probably not going to rely on them as much. And I don't know about you guys, right? But if I'm going to do something, I want to be part of it. So show up saying, right, I'm going to be part of this. And if you can't, for whatever reason, or you don't want to, then don't, right? And that's okay too, right? But if you're going to show up, then show up. Do some basic research. Raise your hand and let folks know simply that I am happy to be a part of this. And I want to make sure that I can add to the. So what is the objective of our conversation today when we're internally prepping, and what is the objective or the main goal we're trying? I want to make sure I understand it. That's an example, right? And you can repeat that, right? But communicate verbally, by your actions, by your participation, that you want to be part of it, right? And then don't take on too much, right? There's a team, right? Don't feel it. So understand your role. And then lastly, don't be hung out to dry. The salesperson leading that charge ultimately should make sure they're the quarterback. They call the play. They call an audible, right? Sometimes it's a pass, and they go, oh, I'm going to run it myself. Or, hey, it's either a pass or a handoff. They make a decision, right? And their job is to make sure everybody is armed for success. So on the other hand, you should expect the team that you're working with to manage your own part, but the team for success, just like a scrum team. Now there's, individually organized and all this stuff, right? But it should be no different in a sales pursuit. So apply the same principles that you would apply to the team that you're building a product for. The same expectations of the scrum master, right? The same expectations of teammates. It shouldn't be any different. And lastly, I'll say this. Just because you're the dev joining a sales pursuit doesn't mean that you're the lackey, or that you're there not knowing what you're doing. You're there for a purpose, and you're there to add value. So you have a voice, and if you're concerned about something, you should appropriately feel comfortable to express that concern. Now, people can agree or disagree, right? But I would go into it with confidence knowing that I've been asked to do this for a reason. I have something to say and I can contribute, and have that confidence, and then just exercise, hopefully professionally and proactively, and with a spirit of cooperation. I mean, cooperation, not cooperation, cooperation, collaboration, all that stuff. And it's no different. To apply those same principles is what I would say. And just know that when you're in front of customers, um, take that extra thought process in terms of how you say things and what you say. Extra, just a little bit more than internal. We're a little more forgiving internally, customers or not. That's the only thing that I would add, right? A little more thought in terms of how and what you say when with a customer.
Yeah. So follow up. Um, the only thing I think is better than a sports metaphor is a tortured sports metaphor, right? So if sales is the quarterback in the process, what position is Dev playing?
Oh man, I love that question. Okay. So I'm gonna say it depends, but I'm gonna answer the question because it does depend. Um, it's a little different. It's gonna be like, okay, it's 1 minute left. The team that was down just scored a touchdown. Less than 1 minute left. They're kicking off. You bring the person in who's going to be a little faster, and they're going to catch a pass from the punter. So you do it sometimes in desperation. So there's a little different versus bread and butter. It's second quarter. It's 13-14. I'm a lineman. I just got to go out and do some blocking and tackling, right? So it can be both. So if it's a general meeting where you're trying to communicate and meet with a customer and some of the, let's say the CTO, right, and his or her 4 or 5 direct reports, and you're bringing in your dev and you're bringing in some leads, and it's really just to say, hey, we want to get to know each other. That's kind of a general play, so it's more generalist, but you are there to you're dressed to impress, but you're not going deep. You're not trying to save anything. It's a little different. Now, if it's, listen, they have one major concern about choosing us over the competition, and it's X, Y, and Z. Let's say it's our architecture, or let's say it's the way that we do something in the cloud, or maybe the cloud provider, and you're bringing in the architect whose job is to convince these people that their concerns are not, they're bubblygook, right? So now you're coming in with a totally different mission, right? It's like the deal's on the line. So it really depends on the situation at hand. So in some cases, it's just kind of bread and butter, and those are important because there's a lot more of those. In some cases, it's, we really need you. Like, this is going to land on yours. You're the hero, but if you fail at this, you're not the GOAT because, we're already there. So there's nothing to do but save it, right? Because we're already sunk unless you save it, right? So it's not up to you to sink or fail. It's up to you. It's all upside, right? So I don't know if that was the answer you're looking for, but that's how I.
No, it's about the journey. It doesn't really matter where we end up. I just enjoy torturing metaphors. What can I say?
Oh, I love it. I love it. I do too. I do too. That's why they're there, though, right?
Exactly.
What initially drew you to just doing sales and revenue growth, and how has your perspective changed and evolved over time?
Sure. No, well, it's changed a lot because, when I first did my first sales interview, I bombed it because I thought it was all about, convincing somebody and talking about how great I would be at something, and I failed miserably, right? And really, it's just the opposite. It's about discovery and then aligning, right? And you align or you don't, right? You can't, at least in most cases, you can't convince people that your product or service is something that it's not. Now, every now and then, maybe somebody could get one by you, right? But and the only way to do that is you really start with trying to understand, right? I can't remember who said it, right? But seek first to understand before being understood. It's somebody famous a long time ago. I should know that quote. But I'll answer it with two things, right? I've interviewed, I don't know, certainly hundreds, and I've hired over 100, certainly over 100 plus sellers in my career. So I've interviewed maybe 10 times that. I don't know if it's 1,000, but it feels like that, right? And there's a couple of questions I always start with. The first one is always, why are you looking, regardless of my organization? And that's part A. And then part B is, what is it that at least has your interest in my organization at this point? Because you're giving some of your time. So always ask that. The second question, or sometimes the first question before that, when I'm meeting somebody for the first time, I love asking, what is it that made you get into sales? And there are some great answers, right? And sometimes, most people don't start in sales. Some do, but most don't start in sales. I didn't start in sales. And one of the things I love hearing, and this is just the numbers, right? It's not pro or con, guys over girls or vice versa. But it seems like it's like 60-40, 60% of the people who answer the answer I'll give you in a minute are female, and 40% are guys, male. Their dad was in sales. I hear that question all the time. My dad was in sales. And I love hearing that, because that usually is they looked up to their dad, right? To me, that's a quality, like I looked up to my dad, right? But I always ask the question, why sales? And sometimes they say I always knew what I wanted to do, and I went into sales right away. Most times it's, I kind of fell into it. I started doing this, and then this happened, and I ended up moving into sales. And that's the majority of the answer. And so that's kind of my answer, right? So I went very quickly. I applied to the Navy Academy. My dad was in the Navy. My grandfather was in the Navy. They said, you're not quite smart enough to come here, but you're not dumb enough where we won't give you a little money to go somewhere else. And so I ended up going to Auburn on a ROTC scholarship, and ended up not going in for 4 years afterwards because I had an issue with my eye. You're a little blurry. You were blurry then. I couldn't fake the final flight physical because I wanted to be a pilot. And that was at the beginning of my senior year. I'd done everything I needed to do. And I'm like, oh, what do I do now? So I was able to get out with, it was either an honorable or medical discharge. I can't remember now. I didn't have to pay anything back. And I went to work for a defense contractor. So I went down as a cost engineer down in Fort Worth, Texas, worked for General Dynamics, helping build F-14s and retrofit other planes. And I was miserable at it. I did not like it at all. It was very black and white and 9 to 5, and you had to take lunch. And I looked around, and it didn't seem to be a lot of upward progression. And so I started calling airlines. If I couldn't fly them. Apparently, I didn't like building them. Maybe I could work for companies that fly them. And I called Delta at the time, and they were like, well, you either start, on the line as a red coat, which is a fine job, just wasn't something I wanted to do it, or get an MBA, and you can come in, on the management ranks. And I'm like, okay, I'll go get an MBA. So I went and got my MBA in Dallas at SMU with a concentration in finance. And guess what? I worked for Continental Airlines, which now is part of United. And I did that for 5 years. But it was during those 5 years, maybe midway through the last year, and the company was just about to file Chapter 11. And but right before then, they were creating a sales program called the BDM, Business Development Manager Program. And they were going to take 13, I remember the number for some reason. They were going to hire people within the company, and they didn't really have sales, right, per se, but they were going to try to go call on Fortune 500, try to drive up business traffic for the airline. And I was one of the guys that they tapped. And it was like 2 weeks before starting that job. So I was still in the finance area. It was actually revenue revenue accounting. I was running a group of revenue accounting, believe it or not, and I was so excited about it. And then we filed Chapter 11, and that program got crushed, got killed, got put off. And I made up. I want to go do that, and so I just started to interview for sales jobs, and it was hard. I thought, everybody would want to talk to me. I have an MBA, but then it wasn't that interesting, right? Just to sales managers. But somebody gave me a chance in Atlanta, and I took my first sales job, and the first few months were some of the most head scratchers. But after 3 months, I actually was making more money than I was. And when I left the job, I was doing very well. I had 52 people working for me, a mix of accountants and analysts, right? And I was doing well with a large company, but I knew pretty quickly that I'd hit, I fell into the right thing. So I guess I'll round it out by saying, for me, and I think for a lot of times for people, is you figure out what you want to do and what goes with the grain by doing a few things that's against the grain, and just it's just hard. And so I got lucky, right, and took a little risk because I took a nice salary job with a big company and went for a small reseller of hardware at a 100% commission sales job. But again, after 3 months, I was actually making more money than I was before, and never looked back. And it ends up, being one of the best decisions that I've made in my life. Not the best, but one of the best, and certainly the best decision I'd say in my career, because it started me on the path that ended with the last 8 years with Spark, which was, a great way to kind of really, move towards the end of my career. So. Good question. I hope that wasn't too much, right? But
no, it's awesome.
That's great.
I've always just secretly been curious, what did you do before, Alex?
Yep.
That's awesome.
Excellent. Well, Alex, do you have any final thoughts you want to share with us before we drop?
Just for you guys or for the podcast?
For the podcast.
For the podcast. Okay. I don't have any for you other than thank you, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. So, so my final thoughts would be, if you're listening to this and you just kind of dialed in, it's not of interest to you, then maybe consider it, right? If you're listening to this because you thought, I've gotten involved a little bit and I'd like to do it more, I would just encourage you to know that technical organizations, and then when I say technical, there's lots of companies that are technical, but I'm really thinking primarily about service companies that build technology for other companies, as well as typically SaaS and product platform companies, or perhaps even hardware companies. When you're asked to be a part of a conversation to either prep the go-to-market team, because sometimes there's value in just helping them get ready for the next conversation, and don't feel like that's second fiddle. Right, that is so important, right? Whether it's prepping them by making sure they understand, how to position something or really understand an answer to something, or being a part of that conversation with a prospective client. I would always take that as a sign of confidence and a vote of confidence that you're asked to do it, and as opposed to looking at it going, oh man, more work. Might be a little more work. But it's a vote of confidence that somebody is putting in you. And it will prove over time, maybe not each and every time, but over time, to help your organization grow and be more successful. And I think anytime you can be a part of that, that should help your career and your career progression. And I think it's one of the most exciting things. And then lastly, it allows you to, I think, really maybe, President, as you mentioned, maybe meet some folks you would never have met before, and build some relationships that, I have relationships with salespeople and bosses from 25 years ago, but I also have relationships with architects and technical folks. I bumped into one at the Atlanta airport. Golly, Raul Misra. I don't know if I'll see this or not, but my age, and we bumped in. It was like we went and had a beer, and I'm like, I can't believe we haven't seen each other. And we said we got to get together. And of course, I haven't called him. Now I'm making a note. You got to call him. You got to get together, catch up. So it's a way also to build some relationships and get to know some folks that I think that you might never do. And I hope that's important to you, right? Because that's what I think life's all about, right? Is building relationships, and you might meet some that you might never have gotten if you didn't kind of put yourself out there and go see what it's like on the other side of the house. So
I love it. Those are
Excellent.
great closing thoughts. Thank you, Alex.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
yeah, thanks for having me. Hope it was good conversation, and can't wait to see this one and the next one. I did watch
Yes.
Jackson's, by the way. That was great.
Awesome.
So I'll make sure Jackson watch mine, and he and I can
Yes.
Can trade
I'll
notes.
tag him.
Yes.
Well, no, we're gonna look to you. We're gonna put you guys on the spot. Whose was better? You guys are gonna have to
They're apples and
give you
oranges.
counts.
Yeah.
I am definitely, Alex, I swear, I'm going to go ask our salesperson tomorrow if I can get on some calls and just see how it works.
I'd
Because I have
love it.
not done that.
Let me
And
hear
I
about
don't
it.
know them. So now I'm all jazzed and excited. I'm going to do it.
Let me hear about it. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you again, Alex.
Opinions expressed on the one-on-one belong only to us and our guests, not to any of our respective employers. Does this platform call to you? Do you need a one-on-one? You can find us on the web at theoneonone.show. That's THE1ON1.show, where you can sign up to be a guest. We also love listener messages. You can email us at contact@theoneonone.show or leave us a voicemail at speakpipe.com/theoneononepodcast. Send us your comments and questions, and we may respond to your message in a future episode. You can also find us in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube by searching for The One-on-One. Please rate and review us on those services. It helps us out a lot. The One-on-One wouldn't be possible without listeners like you and a fantastic community of people who help us in ways large and small. Special thanks to Cameron Cooper, who helps us with marketing, Michael Ducharme, who created our bumper music, and Elena Sage, who's been a huge booster since day one. Thanks for listening.